My name is Kelly Coker. I'm the president of the Dubuque Symphony Orchestra League, and on behalf of the entire league and our board, we welcome you today to the Soundbites event. We're very excited for this concert this weekend. First of all, we're kicking off an amazing season devoted to the youth, and plus the programming for this concert and all the ones in front of us is just fantastic. So we're all in for a real treat, I'm sure. A few items I wanted to take care of on behalf of the league. First of all, we just wrapped up our big membership drive that we do every year. So for everyone that joined the league, we greatly appreciate your membership and your volunteering at all of our events. So if you did sign up for the league, we have our membership booklets available here today. See one of the league members over there. I believe they have them. If not, we'll get them to you through the mail. But anyway, those are here today for you to pick up if you did join the league this year. We do have one event that wrapped up already this season. Our Play for the Symphony Bridge event was held last week and was wildly successful once again. Apparently people can't hear. I'm not exactly sure how to... All right. We'll try this again. Any better? All right. I didn't know I had to use my mom voice. So, as I was saying, thank you to everyone who joined the membership again this year or joined for the first time this year. We greatly appreciate it. Our Play for the Symphony Bridge event wrapped up last week. It was another great fundraiser for us. We put that one on every year because it's so popular and so successful. Coming up on November 10th, watch your mail for an invite to our fashion show for this year called Toast to Fashion. And it will be featuring fall and winter fashions from local retailers. And we'll have hors d'oeuvres and a champagne toast and a red carpet walk with a photographer. So it's going to be a lot of fun. Patty, our events chair, is planning that again for us this year. So it's going to be a fantastic event. And we're already in full swing planning for our Geranium Plus sale this spring. Kay Posey back there in the corner is our chair for that event, and she's already having meetings to get things rolling on that. So watch out this spring for that flyer to come in the mail and place your orders for your springtime flowers. So with all of that, thank you for indulging me and letting me pass all that information along. I'd like to bring up Maestro William Intriligator.
Thank you, Kelly, and welcome, everybody. It's great to see you. I'm so excited to start a new season of the Dubuque Symphony Orchestra. Wow, and what an incredible record crowd we have here today. So really appreciate you coming out, showing your support for the Symphony and for the Symphony Orchestra League. And this year, as you know, we have a theme of youth that is marking the 50th anniversary of our youth ensembles and our youth education programs with the Dubuque Symphony Orchestra. So it was 50 years ago that the Youth Symphony started. And we're celebrating everything related to youth all season long. And it's going to be such an exciting season for that way. I mean, when we just kind of harken back to those days when we were carefree, when there was endless possibilities, just the unbridled joy, just the sort of positivity of youth. And the music that we will perform all season long really reflects that, I feel. Some cases we have music written by composers when they were very young. In other cases we have music that has a youthful spirit. And so I'm just really excited to start the whole season up. I want to take a moment to thank our concert and guest artist sponsor for this weekend's concerts, Cunningham and Butler. They have hosted, or I should say sponsored, the opening night of the symphony for well over, I think, 20 years. And representing Cunningham and Butler, yes. I'm especially delighted that representing Cunningham and Butler is John Link, who is also the president-elect of the Dubuque Symphony Orchestra Board. He's been on the board for a long time. So welcome to John Link and his wife Lauren. So thank you so much for your sponsorship. And we talk about a guest artist sponsorship, but in the case of this weekend's concerts, this is not a guest artist. Our featured performer is one of our family, basically. Joshua Russell is our principal keyboardist and has been for just about 10 years, or maybe more, over 10 years. And this is his second concerto appearance with us, and you've seen him perform in the orchestra numerous times. We'll be talking with him shortly. Please welcome Joshua Russell. And as you know, I'm really committed to promoting young musicians from the tri-state region, and we have had an incredible amount of talent come out of this region, and musicians, composers especially. And this weekend's concert also marks the first time that we will be performing a piece by Adam Odell on our Classics series. And Adam has been he's raised here and went to Clark, and now he's moved on to many other great things. He's getting his doctorate at the Peabody Institute in Baltimore. And Adam is here today along with his parents and aunts and friends. So welcome, Adam. So the first piece on the program this weekend is Barber's Overture to the School for Scandal. And this is a really fun, delightful concert piece. It bears a little bit of explanation because the title might seem a little strange to people. It's based on a play by the playwright Sheridan, and unfortunately the play is not as well known nowadays, but back in the day when Samuel Barber, the composer of this piece, was a student and just 20 years old, studying at the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia. He was studying composition, he was studying piano, and he was studying voice. And then he also had to take courses in literature. And so he was asked to read this play. It's a sort of like an early version of like an Oscar Wilde comedy of manners type of play. It's got social intrigue and plot twists, and there's sort of love triangles going on. It's quite delightful. There's a great version of it on YouTube put out by the BBC in the 70s. I highly recommend it. Anyway, so he read this play and he was sort of inspired by it. Again, he was only 21 years old or so when he wrote this piece, and he was still a student. So what he said was, okay, I want to write my first orchestra piece. And he went on to write incredible orchestral music and operas, but this was his first big orchestra piece. And so he had just read this play and he was inspired by it. You can hear some of the sort of intrigue and sometimes flirtatiousness in the music that are representative of some of the characters and moments in the play. He was actually abroad at the time that he wrote a lot of it. He was in Italy, where he was studying. It was sort of a special semester abroad type of situation because actually there's sort of been a long history of composers going to Italy, winning a prize and going to Italy and writing more music there. There's the whole Prix de Rome in the French Conservatory, and many great composers have done that. So Samuel Barber, I think, was trying to follow in those footsteps. In the end, it was sort of funny because he wrote this piece in Italy and then it won a great prize that allowed him to go back to Italy the next year. So it's sort of like this little sort of interesting part of a canon of composers going all the way back to like Berlioz for whom this happened. Yeah, so this piece shows an incredible mastery of the orchestra. And it's just interesting to think that it was written by a young man who was only 20 or 21 when he was writing it. I'll play you a little bit of it, and I'm going to have to ask for your forgiveness while I get it loaded up here. It's going to take a little bit. Samuel Barber is known for having great melodies, among other things. And you think about his Adagio for Strings as his most famous piece, that absolutely gorgeous Adagio for Strings, which was written 7 years after this piece in 1938. This was written in 1931. This piece doesn't start with the melodies right off the bat. It starts with a playful dissonance in the orchestra that sort of sets the stage for a potential conflict, maybe, that's going on in the play. And again, he's just trying to capture the spirit of the play. So here's how it starts. Let me see if I can get it to play right here. Could you hear that okay?
Yep.
Great. It's an unusual melody, and it has this sort of sneaky quality about it, right? It's plotting something sinister. And as we go ahead in this piece, it will grow to a really great sort of climax moment, restatement. going to jump ahead a little bit. So all of a sudden, after that big theme, we have these various instruments, especially in the woodwinds, like different sort of characters, playful characters, and it's sort of more feminine characters, it sounds like, too, in some of them. And they're sort of playful or flirtatious, coquettish at times. And eventually this will lead to an absolutely gorgeous, this is one of those like great melodies that he writes. And it's first introduced in the oboe. Let me show it to you here. Let's see if I can find it. Just gorgeous, isn't it? It's like, it makes me think of, well, what character in the play would this be representing, or what moment in the play? And there is this one character, Maria, in the play, who is just really honest and about her emotions and about her affections and who she's in love with, and she's a little bit more innocent and youthful than these more older and sort of more sinister sort of people in her social circles who are kind of trying to maybe almost make fun of her perhaps and play with her and taunt her in a way. So I'm thinking that this is the sort of more youthful, sincere moment in the play that represents that character. This is also a fun piece to play as an orchestra. It's very challenging, but it's fun. And this is one of those pieces that years and years ago, musicians in the orchestra said, can we play the Overture to the School for Scandal? And it's been on my sort of list of pieces that I want to program because I knew that the orchestra really wanted to play it for years. So I feel great that we're finally getting to it and starting our season off that way, and sort of giving the musicians what they want is important too. And as you'll see at the performances, it's not easy for them. It's interesting that they wanted this piece. I think that I think one of the things is that it's one of these great American pieces that has this beautiful, sort of American sounding melody too. And it has something for everybody in the orchestra. So it's a great way to start the season. After that piece, we'll do Adam Odell's piece, Refractions. I'm going to come back and talk about that in a second. And then after Refractions, we're going to do Benjamin Britten's Young Person's Guide for the Orchestra. And a great nod to our theme of youth. This is a piece that was written in the 40s as part of a commission. Benjamin Britten was one of the greatest British composers since Purcell. For a long time, there weren't a lot of great English composers. You've got Elgar, and then Britten, and then Vaughan Williams, and all of a sudden Holst, and there were all of a sudden these many in the 20th century. So Britten was one of those group of great British composers that suddenly emerged in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. Anyway, so Britten, among other things, wrote some music for films and for educational films. And so he was contracted by the British Ministry of Education to write a soundtrack to a film about the instruments of the orchestra. And he really did an amazing job. He created this piece that has later gone on to be one of his favorite orchestral pieces. Now he's well known for writing opera music, and the sound of the human voice was so special to him. And he had great success shortly before writing this piece with his big opera, Peter Grimes. And he went on to write some of the great operas of the 20th century. This piece comes right at that moment when he was really embracing the opera, and so this was a little bit of a deviation for him to go back and do a purely orchestral piece. But what it does is, and it takes an old theme by Henry Purcell from, I think it's an oratorio, Abdelazar, from many hundreds of years earlier, and he dresses it up with a full modern symphony orchestra, and with all the percussion and everything that you would never have in Purcell's music from the Baroque era. And he uses that theme as a way to introduce the different sections of the orchestra. First, you hear the whole orchestra, and then you hear the different families of instruments, woodwinds, brass, strings, and percussion. And then he takes it even more specifically and has a variation for each kind of instrument. Flutes and piccolos, oboe, clarinets, bassoons, violins, violas. Each one has its own variation that has its own personality, its own mood, its own kind of style. It's very ingenious the way he's done this. He's sort of captured something about the personality of the different instruments themselves in these variations. And then after the whole thing is done, we've heard all the variations, then there's a fugue that Britten composed, and it's a variation on the original melody. But the fugue goes through in the order of the different instruments that came in, and one by one you hear it, starting with the piccolo, then the flute, and then the oboes, clarinets, bassoons, violins, violas, cellos, bass, then French horns, trumpets, trombones, tuba, and then percussion. And each group adds on and adds on and adds on. And a harp is in there too, I forgot to mention. So it's fantastic. It's this amazing fugue. So every 8 bars or so, another instrument will come in, and the other instruments have to get out of the way. And it's amazing. And it ends with this big climactic restatement of the original theme. I'll play you a little bit of the opening so you can kind of hear what we're talking about here. All right. And then after that full statement, you hear the woodwinds play it. And then the brass come in. Again, it's just so you hear these different colors of the different instruments. The strings come next, and remember, this is all by way of sort of an introduction. The next part is pretty ingenious. The percussion gets it, and if you listen really carefully with the timpani playing some pitches, you can kind of hear the melody in here, even though a lot of the instruments in the percussion are not tuned instruments with actual pitches. But try to imagine that melody as you hear this. Sorry. I went back too far. Okay, here it is. Again, the full orchestra plays it. There's no doubt that you'll have this melody in your mind. He made sure of it. He played it like 6 times for you, twice with the full orchestra, once with each of the 4 groups of the families of instruments. So now that you have that in your mind, and that is sort of the introduction, he'll go through each of these series of different variations with each instrument. And you won't hear that melody precisely. They're variations that are very loosely connected with that theme. But the idea of a theme and variations is important also because we have another theme and variations on this program in the form of the Rachmaninoff Rhapsody we'll tell you about later. Now this piece is sometimes done as just an orchestra piece, and sometimes it's done with an added narration. There was a narration in the original film, and there's an original narration, which is sometimes updated with sort of a little bit more modern language. And we chose to do the narration, and we have invited members of our Dubuque Symphony Youth Ensembles, again, the group celebrating its 50th anniversary. We have 3 of our young musicians from the youth ensembles who will be narrating it in front of the orchestra. So that's going to be really special. I'm really excited about that. So we have the concertmaster of the Youth Symphony, the principal bassoonist of the Youth Symphony, and a flutist in our wind ensemble who will be narrating it. And they're students at Hempstead, and Wallard High Schools. So yeah, so that's going to be great. The fugue is really neat. After all the variations come in, there's this fugue. I'll play you just a little bit of that. You can hear what this sounds like. Let's see if I can find it. Here's the moment where the fugue starts, and it's a sort of an original melody, more Benjamin Britten than Henry Purcell. Piccolo and flute. Next comes oboe. There they are, the oboes. Clarinets will be coming in. Bassoons coming. There. So there's this wonderful counterpoint of various lines going on, but each instrument comes in with that main theme that you'll hear, not main theme, but the fugue theme that you hear first in the piccolo. And eventually it just builds and builds and builds, and it's an amazing piece the way it does that. At the end, the theme of Henry Purcell comes back in the brass, and it's just a glorious moment showing the sonic splendor of a full symphony orchestra. And that's one of the things that makes this piece so special. It's great to hear all the different instruments and the different personalities of the instruments coming through. But then when you hear them all together, there is something magical about that full orchestra sound. And that's what you really get at the end, too. Well, I'm going to ask Adam Odell to come up and join me now. We'll talk a little bit about his piece Refractions that will be having its North American premiere at the performances this weekend. Please welcome Adam Odell. Sure. It's fine. Adam, I think many people here know you and already are familiar with your music. Some of you may have heard the symphony perform some of his music at an Arboretum concert a number of years ago. We did a movement of a saxophone concerto, as well as a piece that you wrote, beautiful piece you wrote for strings, when the Alicia Darlin Award was given to me. And that was so special and meaningful that you wrote that. So thank you. As I mentioned earlier, it's been a long time that I've been wanting to feature your music on our classics series, so I'm really excited to finally do it.
Yeah, same.
And the funny thing is also that you were really hoping that I would do one of your newest pieces called Hypoxia, and I said, well, what's it about? Because we have a theme of youth. Tell them what it's about.
It's about near-death experiences.
I said, okay, well, gee, even though that would be a world premiere, do you have anything else?
Let's earmark that one and put it away for now.
That's for next time. Yeah. But actually, a nice tie-in is that by doing this earlier piece, Refractions, we're actually doing a piece that's a younger piece by you. So it is also tying into that theme. And I think you were, what did you tell me, 22 when you wrote it?
Yep,
Or
22.
Yeah. Amazing. When you hear this piece, you'll be shocked that a 22-year-old will have written this. So give us a little bit of background. Well, before we get into your piece and the details of it, maybe just a little bit of background about yourself and what you're doing now, and like how did you get interested in music, and when did you know that you wanted to be a composer? All these
Sure.
things.
Let's see, where to start. So I've been musical pretty much my entire life. I remember when I was a little kid. This isn't something I remember, this is something I have video of. I was standing in front of my parents' stereo, and like back in the day in the 90s, we had like, you know, the lights that would go up and down with like the EQ, and so I was just standing there just you know, and so that's probably when my musical career really started. But then I started playing piano when I was 7, joined a band in 4th grade, And then I was interested in composing when I was about 14, where I started writing, like, it was mostly jazz tunes at the time, and then I wrote, my Opus 1 was a band piece, which is maybe not the best idea, but that was when I was 16 years old.
When you say band, what kind of band?
Oh, like a wind ensemble
Wind ensemble,
piece.
okay, got it,
So,
yeah.
did that with my high school, and so I went to Dubuque Senior, and Bill Rowley, who's still there today, he was like a great mentor for me, and he was like, wait, yeah, you wrote a band piece? And I'm like, yeah, I got a finale and I wrote this band piece. I'm like, well, let's do it. And I'm like, awesome, yeah. And so that's kind of how I got started there. I think I knew that I wanted to be a composer like as a profession after that first performance where I was like, I could do this all the time. This would be great. And so I went to Clark University and studied with Amy Dunker here in town and got my undergrad degree there. And then after that, I went to Bowling Green State University for my master's degree and spent an additional year there working for some local opera and choir programs as a pianist, and also just kept writing. And then now I am in my second year at the Peabody Institute in Baltimore, where I'm also studying composition and teaching theory. Let's see.
And your composition teacher is a pretty famous living composer right now, Mr. Putz. Tell me
So Kevin Putz is a composer who, yes, I'm allowed to say this now. I have a story that this is like my favorite story to tell, but I wanted to make sure that it was. His big thing is he won the Pulitzer back in the year 2012 for an opera he wrote called Silent Night, which is based on the movie Joie Noël, and so that became really famous. It was performed a lot this past year with the 100th anniversary of the armistice. So he's a Pulitzer winner, and he's currently on sabbatical, so I'm studying with Oscar Bettison. And Kevin Putz is currently on sabbatical because he was commissioned by the Metropolitan Opera. So that's a lot of fun. I get to get tickets to his opera in 2022. So looking forward to that, for sure.
Wow. Have you written a lot of vocal music? It sounds like he has this experience with opera, and is that something that he is promoting you to pursue at all, or is he, how does that work?
So for the most part, he's very much, like especially with the doctoral students, he's very much like, you know what you want to do, and I want to sort of guide you in whatever way you like. But for me, when I applied to Peabody, one of the things that I was really interested in was doing opera, because Kevin had won the opera, the Pulitzer with his opera in 2012, and Du Yun, who is another composer who teaches there, won the 2017 Pulitzer for an opera as well. So there's that, and then there's also what's called the Opera Etudes program at Peabody, where student composers work directly with vocalists to write an opera. So I wrote my first opera this past spring.
Oh, that's cool.
So that was a lot of fun. The opera is called Il Babbo Sa Meglio, which is Italian for Father Knows Best. And it's essentially a parody on sort of the old opera tropes, right? Like if anything like sort of Mozart through Gilbert Sullivan era, there's a lot of operas that have this storyline. There's a father who is a baritone, and there's a friend who is a baritone. And during scene one, they are drinking alcohol, and they were talking about how this father has a daughter who's a soprano, of course, has a love interest who is a tenor, and they don't very much appreciate that they are dating. And so the friend says, hey, why don't you marry your daughter off to me? And they both think it's a good idea. And then scene two comes along, and then like everyone, the mother and the daughter and the love interest are all very distraught at this because it's creating this conflict, and then the mother and the love interest have to come up with some plot to convince the father to change his mind, and then in the meantime, the daughter sort of doesn't have any agency over any of this, and then me living in the 21st century and being a feminist myself, I'm just like, well, this doesn't seem like a very good trope to continue. And so I won't necessarily repeat any of the lines that sort of lead to this moment because there's some profanity in them, I will admit that.
Is it in Italian?
It's no, it's not actually in Italian. It's the first 5 minutes is actually written to sound like a bad English translation of an Italian opera. But then, so the first scene happens exactly as I described it at the beginning, and then the father comes in and says, hey, why don't we do this? And then everybody in the family's like, are you insane? No, that's awful. And then the rest of the conflict is essentially, wait, this is usually the main thrust of an opera. Now what are we going to talk about? What is going to be the conflict? And then it's essentially the idea of like, what can we explore in the 21st century in opera that are topics that are sort of more relevant to us today. So that's a bit of the story of that. Yeah. Not yet. So we're hoping that it eventually will be about an hour. So this program allowed us about 20 minutes. So it's a 20-minute with a chamber orchestra, and then 4 main characters and a women's chorus.
Fantastic. Well, tell us a little bit about the piece we're going to hear this weekend, Refractions. This is a purely orchestral piece.
Yes.
And you have really specific ideas about what inspired this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wrote this piece immediately after I graduated from Clark, and I was in contact with who would be my primary professor at Bowling Green. And they have a symphony reading program there where you can get a reading with the Toledo Symphony as a student composer. And I wound up doing that my second year, so it wasn't this piece that I did that with. It was actually Hypoxia was the piece that wound up getting read by the Toledo Symphony during my second year. But I was writing this in the summer, sort of between, so I was on my own in a lot of ways. I didn't have somebody that I was meeting with every week. I didn't have a composition professor that I was specifically talking to. But one thing that I had really realized in the last 2 years of my undergrad is it was really important during my time as a young student to sort of stretch myself in the ways that I go about writing a piece. And in a lot of ways, I was always very sort of like letting my intuition sort of do what it wanted to do. It's like, oh, this sounds good, and this will work this way. And so I wanted to challenge myself with Refractions to do a lot of writing that's sort of based on process. And so I had this visual idea. I've always been a really visual composer. I've always had visual ideas to the music that I'm working on. And with Refractions, my idea was like the idea of taking the white light and it moving through a prism and going into its sort of component light frequencies. So for those of you who are Pink Floyd fans, like Dark Side of the Moon, that album cover was basically what my image was. And so I started that off, and I thought, okay, what's a nice way? Like, it can start off with something really simple where I have, there we go, where it's just like one pitch, and then it can sort of split into sort of these nice frequencies together, and then when they start to split off even more, they can become this really big cluster of sound. And it was like, that to me sounded a lot like what I would imagine light splitting. That's sort of how I heard that. And that was working for a really long time. I had this process of, here's how the pitches will fit together, and here's how it will all work. And it was going really well, which was kind of surprising to me, because like using that kind of process was sort of unusual to me. But then after a while, that sort of started to not work anymore. And actually, the place where it stopped working was when I was visiting my family up in Michigan at my aunt's lake house, and my aunt is here today. And so I wrote a whole bunch of it while I was there. And I was sitting at the piano, and I was thinking like, okay, so now I've got these big chords that I'm working with, and based on this layout that I've created, there's this chord, and then that should go to this chord. And then that chord didn't sound right, and I'm like, okay, all right, let's go back, let's figure it out. Okay, so I've got this chord, and now I go to this chord. Nope, that's not it either. Okay. And then what happened was I was coming up on the deadline to finish this piece, and I really wanted to get going with it, but I also wanted to spend some time with my family because I'm on family vacation. And then what happened, the way I basically balanced that out, my niece Claire was 1 year old at the time, and so I had her just sitting in my lap as I was composing, and I was just like sort of bouncing her on my knee, and then writing some extended harmony, and then bouncing her on my knee again. And then I was sitting at the piano? I was sitting at the piano, and yeah, she was just like right here, and I was just like, okay. It's like, no, that one was earlier, that one didn't, no, that doesn't work. And then I just had her sitting there, and then she just went, blep! And then she like played some notes, and I was like, those were the right notes. And then I was just like, what did she just hit? This one? Yeah, oh, that's it. And so when you're really into a process that's very much based on logic, and this flowing into this and this flowing into this, I think it's probably the biggest wake-up call when a toddler gets it right before you. Then it's time to just let the piece be the piece. And so that's sort of what wound up happening. And so the way that I looked at light reflecting off of the surface wound up being very different. So after that, I took some manuscript paper and I went down to the shore of the lake, and I thought, you know what else is light reflecting off water? the sunset off of the lake. And that's a very different way of looking at light reflecting off of something, because the sunset is moving, the colors are changing, the water is moving, and so I started thinking about refractions in sort of two very different ways, where like you'll still hear that process to it, but then there will be moments where it's just, hopefully, that these notes are just doing it because it feels right.
You know, when you mentioned going down to the lake, it suddenly clicked with me, because I've been studying this piece and I've been trying to understand the different episodes in it, the different structure of it. And I was actually thinking about asking you, how can you help our listeners here when they hear the piece, to what kind of experience do you want them to go through as they're going through the different sections of the piece, because they're sort of big paragraphs. And when you mentioned the light reflecting off the lake, it suddenly made me think of maybe, I don't know if I'm right on this, but maybe that's the part with the vibraphone and the strings. It has that shimmering thing.
Yeah.
Oh, that totally makes sense. Now I understand. Because I was, yeah.
Wonderful.
That is exactly it. So like there's this little interjection in the middle of the piece where he's been doing exactly what he's talking about with the sound that grows to these different kinds of chords and clusters, and then he experiments and extends that, and then all of a sudden there's like a new chapter that begins, and it's this, the light reflecting off the lake.
Yeah. I
Is
need to
there any
update
other
those
kind
program
of,
notes.
yeah, that's great. Is there anything else that you want them to imagine or think about or feel when they're listening to your piece? Or should we play a little bit of
Yeah, we
recording
can
of it?
certainly,
I
absolutely
can
we
get
can.
that loaded up while you talk.
Yeah, and so, yeah, I think that was sort of, I think that story sort of, it does a lot of it for me, where I had this idea of, this is sort of where things naturally need to go, or like based on this idea I have, and then, you know, the world sort of has a different idea. That was kind of like an important learning moment just for me as a person. And I don't know, so whenever I think of this piece now, I do think of that latter portion of being up at the lake and just relaxing, and like, you know, I don't have anything near me but my manuscript and my pencil, and I'm, you know, sitting a Michigan sunset at 7 p.m., which is about the best thing you could possibly have. Well, more 8 p.m., I guess, is probably when we have the best colors, right? Yeah, so about 8 p.m. So find a happy place when you listen to this piece, I guess, is my big thing. Because that's my happy place, and that's where I was writing it.
We'll just give them a little sample of the very opening of the piece.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here's a little bit of it. A little bit of the very opening. It's beautiful, gorgeous, yeah. So much talent, and it's so great that he just came right out of Dubuque. I've lost track of the time a little bit, and I hope we have enough time to really dig into the other two pieces on the program. Please join me in welcoming our piano soloist, Joshua Russell. Joshua, just remind us a little bit about your background and where you live, and you have an interesting day job too, and you're juggling a lot of things, and tell us about some of that real quick.
Certainly, sir. I am from Peoria, Illinois. I live in Peoria. I have been playing with the symphony up here for a little over 10 years. And my musical background, I started playing the piano as a young child, and frankly didn't like it very much. And I actually talk about this a lot. I think the piano oftentimes is a challenge because you're by yourself. Your friends are out playing baseball, doing other things. But singers, you have choir, other instruments, sometimes you have band or orchestra. And so for me, when I got to a place where I could actually start to play with other people, particularly accompanying choirs, things of that nature, I really fell in love with playing. And from there, pursued music as a career. I have about 10 years of university teaching experience. I've had some wonderful students through the years that have gone on to have very exciting careers in the music field. Some of them won some really substantial competitions and played some major venues and spent about 10 years doing that, and then realized that I really, really loved teaching. I loved the teaching aspect of it so incredibly much, and actually had another teaching opportunity that came along a couple of years ago to become the founding headmaster of a new private high school in Peoria, Illinois. And so I had left the music teaching world at least a little bit. I still have some private students and so forth, and I'm now the headmaster of this new school. It's a school that's based on a classical curriculum, and it integrates everything into the program. All of the students take all of the math and science, they take all of the humanities, philosophy, history, literature, language, and they all take all of the arts programs. So every kid in the school takes art for 4 years, music for 4 years, and drama for 3 years.
Wow.
And it's something I think is really cool. And what it does, here's my segue into what I want to talk about here in terms of the music of the concert. Once you see that and you start to understand all of these other aspects about history, literature, culture, and so forth, that's when you can really fully start to grasp and understand the arts, music and art, because they reflect the culture, sometimes shape and sometimes reflect the culture in which they were written. And I think this is very, very true for the pieces that I'm going to play with the symphony tomorrow night and Sunday. And so even though there are some really compelling reasons for us, which we are programming the Rachmaninoff first on the program, and that makes a lot of sense. I actually want to talk about the Gershwin first, because it came first, actually, surprisingly. Sometimes we don't realize that it actually was written, the Rhapsody in Blue, 10 years before the Rachmaninoff Rhapsody. And it reflects kind of my idea here. And there was something going on in culture at the time the Rhapsody in Blue was written that influenced it, and particularly in New York. In the early 1900s, there were a lot of clubs, nightclubs, and people would go out, and a really important part, obviously with so many of them, they were competing with one another. And to get people to come into the club, one of the major draws was the pianist, actually. The pianist was very important in this. And so the clubs would hire the best pianists that they could find, and they were really competitive with each other, because whoever could draw the most people in, they'd bring into that club and they would end up making more money. It would be a better job for them. And so they were looking for influences absolutely everywhere. And so the jazz pianists in these clubs in Harlem were listening to popular music, they were going to classical concerts, they were listening to orchestras, they were listening to piano recitals, and they were taking ideas from all of those and implementing those into their music. And so you see this Beethoven, Schumann, Schubert, all of these things, different ideas, figurations were worked into this jazz idea. And this is very common in this time period. And so to me, it's not a big surprise when you see the other thing happens, that now in the concert hall in 1924, Gershwin has a piece for originally band, it becomes orchestrated, that is influenced by these jazz styles, and we start to see that.
So the influence goes the other way. Instead of the jazz brought to the orchestra world instead of the orchestra brought to the jazz clubs. Yeah,
right, exactly.
It's the same idea.
It's that same kind of idea, this cross-pollination across all of these places. And I don't know, there's an interesting story. I've never been quite sure if this aspect of it was true or not, but that one night George and Ira Gershwin were playing pool, and they see this ad for Paul Whiteman's orchestra playing this new piece featuring jazz and classical by George Gershwin, and he's like, oh wait, I agreed to do that, and I forgot about it, and it's next month. And so I've heard that story told several times. I've never been absolutely sure of the source on that one, but anyway, Gershwin started to, he had these ideas in his mind for the Rhapsody in Blue, these various themes, and then he was on his way to a concert in Baltimore where there's a premiere of one of his works, and it was on the train that he started to really flesh out these ideas. And the thing that's so fascinating is he didn't really necessarily think about it as just like a large formal structure. It kind of plays like, and is put together like a series of Gershwin songs or melodies that are put together, and that's why so often you see different kind of versions of this, different edits of this, where people can make cuts and put it together in different ways, because it was really kind of conceived this way.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, the term rhapsody doesn't just refer to sort of lyrical quality, but it also refers to the form itself, which is sort of more like a fantasia where it's loosely not really following a strict maybe sonata form or a concerto form or something like that, and that it's all kind of blended together. And in a way, in the classical world, I think that's another meaning of that word rhapsody, is that so he sort of stitched together all these things, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And you see that, and in fact, Gershwin originally had the idea of calling it an American fantasy. I think it was his original title. And then it was actually his brother, who was always great with the lyrics, right? Great with the words, that suggested the idea of Rhapsody in Blue as the title of it.
Yeah. And then tell them who was in the audience at the first performance of Rhapsody in Blue when Gershwin was playing with Paul Whiteman.
Great, and so this idea of the different influences is always fascinating in music. And so the night of the premiere of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue in 1924, I think it was February 12th, there were several famous composers, musicians there. Jascha Heifetz was there, Ferdi Grofé, I believe, was there, and Stravinsky. There was I knew there was one other major composer, and then Sergei Rachmaninoff.
Yeah.
Rachmaninoff was at the premiere of the Rhapsody in Blue. And so you see, 10 years later, Rachmaninoff, actually he wrote a little bit later, he wrote his fourth concerto. He actually had some jazz elements in that.
Yeah.
It was not his most successful work, but then he wrote the Rhapsody on the Theme of Paganini, and you see all of a sudden this title of Rhapsody. And that to me has always just been a little suspicious that there had to be some kind of influence there, at least to some
And there
degree.
were some jazzy moments, definitely.
Certainly, I think so. And so you see this with the Rhapsody, and the Rhapsody of Rachmaninoff is, he was turning. I think there's another level at which he's obviously looking at influence of other composers. He had recently written his variations on a theme by Corelli. You see this as a variation on the theme of Paganini, the famous violinist, and it's based off of the 24th Caprice for violin of Paganini. And it's a very, very simple melody, very simple tune that has been used by a number of composers through the years. And
Brahms, Liszt, Schumann, many of them wrote variations or versions of this. Did you want to play a little bit of the basic melody?
So you can hear the basic melody. Pretty simple, right? And it's just this kind of idea of the energy propelling from the bass to here. And that's really kind of the bare bones of it. And in fact, after a very brief introduction in the Rachmaninoff Rhapsody, he actually gives us the first variation before he even gives us the full theme.
Yeah.
So it just starts with the orchestra outlining that, and then you hear the actual theme in the violins, and the piano then starts to take this very basic outline and start to embellish. Like that.
And that's just the variation number 2. Wait until it gets going.
Right, there are a lot of notes.
A lot of notes. There are a number of different characters that are evoked in the different variations. I like to think of variation 14 as being something that almost is like a tribute to his time in America, because it almost has a sort of Western or Copeland-like quality about it. Yeah, ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-ba-bum.
Absolutely.
It goes through all these different variations, and an important part of it is also that there's this other melody that he brings in, a melody that was very important in a lot of his works. Tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So Rachmaninoff had this kind of obsessive fear of death, actually. We see that written about by a number of his close friends. And as a result of that, he chooses a melody in a lot of his works. There are a number of works that speaks to this. And it's the Dies Irae melody from the Roman Catholic plain chant from a funeral. Dies Irae, Dies Illa, Day of Terror, Day of Wrath, like that. And he comes in a few variations into this piece and introduces this melody, and it really gives a gravitas to this piece and the kind of contemplation. And to me, I think that's where the story of the piece starts to revolve. There have been a lot of speculations because one of the other implications of the term rhapsody is this idea of story. And say, is there an actual story? And Rachmaninoff was really hesitant to reveal stories in his music. And sometimes he would actually reveal a story or an influence, like this piece is based on this painting or something, And it wasn't actually even true. You're like, it was based on this, but then later you're like, no, it wasn't
He was
actually.
trying to get them off the rail, track
Right.
the descent of the
Exactly. And so you see the introduction of that. Gets introduced into this piece, and the whole piece, almost to me, if there is a storyline, there was a ballet written that was revolved around this piece, to kind of trying to tell the story of Paganini, who sold his soul to the devil, and this love interest that he had, and those love themes and so forth. But I think it comes down to more like the triumph of good and evil, love and death, kind of like that, which comes to its culmination in the very famous 18th variation that everybody knows.
Play a little bit of that?
Sure, absolutely. And so, if you take the main melody, make it major, flip it upside down, and put it in D flat major.
There's a funny comment that Rachmaninoff made, the tongue-in-cheek comment, where he said, "This one I wrote for my agent."
That's right.
It's the Elgar Enigma variations. The most beautiful part of that, he said, that he dedicated to his agent.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like he knew it would be the money piece. It's like,
And there's one other thing that I want to point out in this, and this may be stretching my theory of influence too far, but I do want to point something out here. Because if you listen to this melody, right? If you take that.
oh my gosh. That's the Rhapsody in Blue.
Yeah, you've got the Rhapsody in Blue melody.
Yes.
You get the Rhapsody in Blue melody in there. Orchestrated the same way. It's the same.
It is. That's
Same tune.
incredible. Wow. Did not get that.
I don't know. It may be taking that a little
Brilliant.
too far, but
No.
I think that it has to be. It's scored the same way. It's the famous love melody, and I think that has to be.
Wow, brilliant. You continue to surprise me. A number of years ago, we featured you in two concerto-like pieces, one by a Haitian composer, Justin Ali,
Right.
and then the Grand Tarantelle Gottschalk. And you were so wonderful then. This has been a long time. Ever since then, I wanted to feature you again, and this has been a long time coming. In fact, you got to perform this under a different conductor in a shortened version at the Arboretum with John Donovan, one pursuit of the podium. He's right here, and so John got the pleasure of doing Rhapsody in Blue with you. Now I finally get to do it.
I look forward to it.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you all. And again, I want to close just with a thank you. The namesake of the school where I teach is an English author. His name is G.K. Chesterton, and he said that thanks are the highest form of thought, and gratitude is happiness doubled by wonder. And so I just want to close with a couple of thank yous. I want to thank all of you that are here today for being here. I want to thank all of you for your attendance, your support of the symphony. I want to thank William for programming this and his leadership through the years. I want to thank John Donovan, who has been my sponsor here at the symphony since we've had a sponsorship program. I have just delighted in getting to know him through the years and have appreciated that support. And I thank our concert and our guest artist sponsors. This just simply would not be possible to share all of this beautiful music with you and the community. It's a really beautiful, rich thing that you have here in Dubuque. It's a very special thing. And so I just close with those thank yous.
Brilliant.
Classy guy. Wonderful. And I again want to thank you all for coming out. This record attendance gives me so much energy for this weekend, and I think it's going to be a fantastic concert. I encourage you to join us next month when we'll have a young Australian violin protege, continuing the theme of youth. She's very young, and we'll be playing the beautiful Mendelssohn Concerto and other pieces featuring youth on that one too. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy the concerts.